Hey, what's up? Welcome to another episode of Wassup Conversations, a podcast featuring iconic figures in pop culture. I'm your host, Hamid Reza Nikufar, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming a renowned game designer, director, and writer whose career boasts an impressive track record of success, with both mainstream hits and cult classics like Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, and most recently, Pentiment. My legendary guest is no one but Josh Sawyer. In this episode, Josh and I delve into the world of ideas, how they are generated, incorporated into creative works, and shaped into compelling narratives. We also discuss his writing and directing techniques, the art of deconstructing murder mysteries, and even his favorite movies. Before we delve in, remember to subscribe to Wassup Conversations on YouTube and all the major podcast and streaming services. If you're enjoying the show, your support means a lot. Thank you very much. Let's go. Hello and welcome to Wassup Conversations, Mr. Sawyer. As I mentioned earlier, you were high on my list of people I wanted to talk to, and I've been eagerly waiting for this moment over years, so I truly appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's more exciting that it falls on Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day. Yeah. So, how was your last year after releasing this hugely successful Pentiment? Did you slow down or jump right into another project?
It was uncharacteristically slow, I guess, because Obsidian has two big projects going right now. We have Avowed and Outer Worlds 2. And to be honest, I don't have a staff to do another project. Everyone's sort of helping out on the existing projects. So I also was helping out, or I'm still helping out on those projects. But I did get to travel quite a bit. Thankfully, we were nominated for a number of awards, so I got to travel to Europe a number of times. And yeah, so I wasn't in vacation mode, but I didn't dive straight into another project. So I'm just helping out on other projects at the studio for the time being.
Wow, that's great news. That's great news. I'm super excited for both of those projects, by the way. So,
Thank you.
Pentiment was my favorite game of 2022's, and we'll definitely dig deeper into it later. However, considering this amazing opportunity to speak with a true artist, I wanted to understand how you think and work. So I think it would be interesting to know how ideas are born for you and how you nurture them. How do you prepare yourself to be receptive to ideas at any moment? And when is the perfect time to transform them into reality, into an art form?
That's a really big question.
Yeah.
I'll try to answer it as
Yeah.
best as I can. I find that I get a lot of my best ideas, I think, while riding my bike. I'm a cyclist. I don't ride as much as I used to, but I still try to ride a fair amount. And I think a lot while I'm riding, just about a lot of stuff, but it often drifts back towards games and ideas for games. And I can pull inspiration from a lot of different places. I am a big film buff. I'm sure there are people that are more cinephiles than I am, but I do watch a lot of films and I am inspired by a lot of them. Of course, I take a lot of inspiration from other games as well. And I don't usually have aha moments where suddenly, just out of nowhere, something fully forms in my head. So, usually it will take a while for an idea to develop into something that I really feel confident about. For Pentiment, it was literally years before I felt like I could actually pursue it. In a lot of cases, it's an idea, and I'll talk about those ideas with people, coworkers or friends. And then it just stays an idea and it's fun to talk about. But in a lot of cases, it'll just kind of stay there until it seems like there's an opportunity to do something with it. And, I wouldn't say I'm quite an idealist, although I have different standards for the stuff that I work on now than I used to. But also I understand there are practical realities. To execute on certain ideas, you need a specific team staffed in a certain way, of a certain size. You need the right people in the right positions. You need the right technology. You need a supportive publisher. And if those things aren't really there, then, I will often look at, what's something else that I can work on or do. And maybe that opportunity will come up later, or maybe it won't. But I try to be pretty flexible about, understanding that not every project idea that comes into my mind is going to be something that I'm going to get a chance to do. And that's okay. In a lot of cases, it's just fun to think about and talk about with people, and accept that it's all part of the process of moving towards the things that you actually do develop.
Yeah, do you go looking for an idea, or usually you have pretty much a lot of ideas, or write it down, and when a right project comes, you just go to your I don't know, notes and like, oh, this dialogue, for example, oh, this setting, this event that could work in this project.
To be honest, I don't write a whole lot down, but I do keep a lot of things floating around in my head. And so, for example, for a very long time, I'd been thinking about, like, literally, 20 years, I'd thought I'd really love to work on a historical role-playing game. The idea that I had in my head for it was something that was more like old isometric games, like party-based games, and it was, very combat-oriented and things like that. And then over time, that shifted a little bit. And then, I saw, Kingdom Come Deliverance was a very sort of like strictly historical, like there's a little bit of fiction in the main character story, but it's there's no magic or anything like that, and it's played very straight. And I was like, oh, that's cool, like, maybe something like that, but I didn't really dig in deep on it. And then around 2018, I played Night in the Woods, and that's when I started to get the idea, which also this is getting a little convoluted, but we had been pitched by another studio on co-developing a detective game. And I didn't really, honestly, I didn't like the pitch, but it made me think, like, because I was like, well, this sounds like every other detective game, but not in an interesting or innovative way, and certainly not in a way that I think Obsidian would do it. So then it made me think about, how would Obsidian, or how would I interpret an Obsidian RPG? And I thought, well, we wouldn't tell you who the murderer is. Like, you would basically have to just deal with the consequences of accusing someone and play with it. And that didn't go anywhere. Like, the codev thing didn't go anywhere, but that idea stuck in my head. And then, yeah, it started to coalesce around, like, oh, you know what? I think I could probably, like, it could be cool to make a game that was historical, and it was like a murder mystery with that ambiguity, but the visual style is like Night in the Woods. And I thought, I bet I could do that with like a dozen people. And I was like, but I don't, like, why would Obsidian do that? Or, like, would I have to kickstart it? So again, I just sort of stayed there for about a year, which is a pretty short amount of time to have that specific idea. And then Microsoft acquired the studio. And, during the acquisition, they were talking about how big Game Pass was for them and how they really wanted unique titles for Game Pass. And then I was like, okay, this is it. Like, we can make this game with a dozen people, maybe 3 years, which it was like almost exactly 3 years, and it was 13 people. But yeah, we were able to do it. And so it was that combination of conditions that really allowed me to go, like, okay, this is the thing. So all that stuff just kind of floated around for a long time until a picture of where it could go became clear to me.
Yeah, and sometimes an idea before starting a project is so perfect, so different, and it's very personal. But it could be kind of like change by the other form of mediums that are around you. For example, you watch a movie or play a game, and this just changed that idea. Do you think that that's healthy, or do you think that you should protect the initial idea and doesn't get dirty by other stuff?
I don't believe in that. I think you like, everything that took you to the point where you started, like, that's all cumulative, right? All the bad stuff, all the things that you went through, failures, things you saw, listened to, things drop in and out. And I feel like you have to be flexible when you're developing things, both You have to listen to your own instincts, but you also have to listen to other people and the feedback they give, because, ultimately, from my perspective, I'm trying to create an experience. And sometimes those experiences are very specific and sometimes they're very broad. And especially in the broad case, the specific way that I pursue creating that experience might just not work. What I think is going to achieve that feeling for a player, sometimes they play it and they're like, this sucked, man, like this, or either it does it, but it has this side effect that's really negative. And so I feel like you need to be open to that stuff. And you need to also, while you are working on it, you're continuing to talk to people, have experiences, consume media of all different forms, and that can inform your ideas. So, I wasn't quite sure what the scope of Pentiment was going to be. And I went back and I rewatched a Polish film called The Mill and the Cross. And it's about Bruegel the Elder creating the Procession to Calvary, the painting, which is this beautiful Mannerist painting with hundreds of figures in it. And there's a line, Rutger Hauer actually plays the artist in the film, which is very cool. And he says very early on, my painting needs to be big enough to hold everything, everyone, all the people. And Mannerist paintings have this, they don't have usually central, or very often they don't have like a central figure that's very prominent. They have sort of these spread out scenes with many, many, many characters. And I thought that was very powerful also for showing a wide spectrum of society, like showing, charcoal burners and Romani and peasantry and middle-class people and nobles and monks and nuns of all different sort of like vocations. And so, but that made me think, we need to make sure that we can make enough characters to show the full spectrum of society. Wow. And that within any given class, even though it wasn't understood as such as the time, there can't be simply one character that represents it. We have to show something that is deeper and shows that there's more dimension. Like there's not just a nun, there are many nuns, and they're, the way that they live within their vocation is very different for each of them. And the same with peasants and things like that. So, if I had not listened to that, who knows what direction I would have gone in. Maybe the cast would have been much smaller. And I don't think that the game would have had the effect it did of creating the sense of community where you feel like Kearsaw and Tassing are these two separate but interconnected communities. So yeah, I think you have to be open to changing as you work on something.
Wow, yeah, that's a great example. So sometimes a personal projects and commercial products can conflict. Pentiment is a great example. Looking at this project, you see a personal game in terms of artistic choices and taste. However, considering its origins, it's somewhat miraculous. This small adventure game made by a few people was created at Obsidian, one of the greatest RPG studios, owned by the most valuable company in the world. So considering this project as something that rare and unusual, let's talk about the battle of an artist in any medium or department that faces between market demands and personal expression. When faced with such situations, how do you think someone can pour their heart and soul into their art form?
So I do think that it takes time to develop perspective on these things. Especially when you're, I won't say young, but you're sort of like new to the industry.
Yeah.
And, don't quite necessarily understand all the ways in which it works or doesn't work. Or sometimes the rug gets pulled out from under you, or there are practical constraints. And when that happens, you're kind of going as fast as you can towards the thing you want to do, with no safety net, no emotional safety net. And so when that gets pulled out from under you and you sort of hit your chin on the floor because you're going so fast with no concern for your own well-being, because you can't see anything other than the thing you're trying to do, it can be extremely painful and very demoralizing. In the first half of my career, I want to say like 6 projects canceled.
Wow.
That I was working on or leading. I think 5 that I was leading. And some of those I had very, very emotional, like strong connections to, and others I had less of a strong connection to. But it did teach me to have a healthy sort of level of detachment, but it can also go the other way where you become kind of jaded and cynical, and the work becomes, where you're like, well, this is what people want, I guess, or like, well, this is what the publisher asked us to do, so I guess we're doing it. And, unless you're doing things on your own, you always have to accept that there are compromises to what you do. My father is a sculptor and a bronze sculptor, and he did commissions, he's retired now, but he did commissions for most of his career. And, he has one customer, but he's the only person doing the work. So his level of compromise was really based off of his own taste, which he has very high personal opinions on what he will and won't do. I think I'm a little more flexible than my dad is, but it did teach me a lot about understanding that boundary. And, when you're working either directly with a client or for an audience, you have to understand their expectations, which doesn't mean you need to follow all of their expectations. But when you don't meet their expectations, you have to do that very consciously and cognizant of, that there might be a negative reaction, or you have to sort of tailor it in such a way where you play with that expectation. Like, oh, you thought I was going to do this, but we did this instead. And hopefully you're, even more thrilled that we didn't do the thing that you thought we were going to do. But I feel like if you are making something and you have no expectation of making money and you have no expectation of earning anyone's respect, then you can do whatever you want in any medium. Like, for real, like if you are working with no one and you don't care what they think, and you put it out and you don't care of the opinions of the people who consume it, and you don't care if anyone buys it, you can do whatever you want. If you care about making money, if you care about working with other people, if you care about getting approval or communion, let's say, with people to create the experience that is ultimately positive. It doesn't mean it's fun or good, but like it creates the experience that you want. If you care about that, then you have to keep all those other people in your mind, right? They're part of it. They're part of the process. But you can't let it dominate what you're doing to the point where you're miserable.
Yeah.
Right. Because then the job is no longer the thing that you came to it for, probably in the first place. And that's not to say that everyone in games comes to it for the same reason, but I love playing games. I got into games because I wanted to create experiences that were like the experiences that moved me. But that means that I have to think about that audience. Yeah. They have to be present with me. And when I work with my teammates, if I can't get buy-in from them, if they're like, I don't think this is going to be good, I don't buy it, then I either have to work with them to convince them, or I have to step back and go like, man, like nobody is on board with this. Like, am I wrong? And that's again, I think that's part of the process. If you want like true freedom, then you're making something that's not for profit, and it's not for approval, and it's not being made with anyone else, right? You're just doing it on your own for the sake of making it, and you just completely ignore what happens after you put it into the world. I think most people can't do that. If you can do that, and that's the way you want to do it, that's great.
Yeah. There's this beautiful quote from Gandhi that says, compromise is based on give and take, but there can be no give and take on fundamentals. Any compromise on mere fundamentals is a surrender, for it is all give and no take. So I think it's very important to just agree on the fundamental and then start, pouring yourself on that foundation.
I think that's really true. And for Pentiment, one of the things right away, some people said like, well, what if people don't like to read? And I'm like, they're not going to like this game. Like, yes, we have text to speech, and I'm glad we have that for accessibility. But for people who, that's not really the issue, where they're like, I just don't like reading, this isn't the game for you. One of the things that I thought was, well, funny, a little aggravating, let's say, is a lot of the reviews that would come out for Pentiment were qualified. Like, all the reviewers had to say, well, no, this isn't for everybody. Like, I like it, but it's not for everybody. No game is for everybody. Yeah. Like, first-person shooters aren't for everybody. Yeah. I think there is the expectation of, well, here's the real gamer market. Here's the core gamer market. and games are for them, and that's everybody. And it's like, well, that's not really true. That's just the way we've made games. And that's also fine if that's what the dominant type of game that we make is. That's okay too. But I do think that you're right, where, if you don't like 2D art, you're not going to like Pentiment. If you don't like, reading, you're not going to like Pentiment. And that's okay. I do think that when you start talking about, hey, are you now alienating the audience that you're trying to reach? That's where you have to go like, oh, crap. Like, yeah. For example, if we had put a lot of really challenging manual dexterity mini games into the game that is primarily reading, that's probably not what our audience came to the game for. And that's why our mini games are really simple and really easy.
Yeah. So you studied history in university. What's so exciting about history that makes you so curious about it to the point where you used it on the foundation of many of your projects?
Something that I like to say to people that tell me that history is boring is that everything cool that has ever happened in the world is part of history. So also there's a lot of stuff that isn't interesting and is very boring. And like any story, the way that you tell it is, will determine how people receive it. You can take the coolest story and reduce it to something that's extremely boring. But that's the challenge with any story, right? So history, often, the more I would read about it and the more I would learn about it, one, it gave me a greater understanding of how we came to be who we are today. Our culture and individually and everything. But also then just these anecdotes and these weird things where you go like, oh, wow, that's like, that really happened? That's nuts. Like, and sometimes it's some anecdote like Barbarossa drowning on the, like, something really silly, like he just drowned, the emperor just drowned crossing a river. That was the end of it. Something really ridiculous like that. And so I just think that, understanding what happened before us and hearing it explained in a way that is engaging is really exciting to me. And, often when I would talk about making a historical game, a lot of the devs that I would talk to had a negative reaction because they had bad experiences in school learning history because they were poorly told stories, right? Like they were things they were not super interested in, and they were also told in a way that really just put them off, like memorizing dates and just really dry stuff. And, I wanted to, what I would always say is, why don't you assume that I do it well, that I'm telling cool stuff well in an interesting way with engaging characters and good dialogue. I'm not trying to make people learn dates. That's not like the focus. That's not what I'm trying to do. But it kind of took doing it to show people what I was, trying to do. They have a picture in their mind, but then once I showed it, they were like, oh, okay, now I understand. Yeah, this seems cool. So yeah, I just, I find history very interesting, and I think it's very good and healthy to understand it.
And you look at it very interestingly and create interesting art as a result. So, looking at the state of the world right now, what is the biggest lesson we could learn from history?
Oh, geez,
that's a really hard question. I know.
No, I mean, there's so much. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is. The foundations of almost everything that's happening go back a lot farther. Like people have a very short perspective on how we are, where we are. One of the things that I like to say kind of jokingly is that like World War II indirectly is the result of Charlemagne's heirs not splitting up his empire well. Right? Like in a way that's actually true, because it's how Alsace and Lorraine and like all of these places were split up, and then they became these border territories between these different countries, and then that later changed into France and the German Republic in the late 19th century, and that's World War I, which then leads to Treaty of Versailles and leads to World War. But it actually goes back all the way to Charlemagne, maybe even earlier than that. And so any conflict, one thing I really am into the show Babylon Berlin, and that's a lot of that is about Weimar Germany. And they're showing the stock market crash, which had a lot of rampant speculation. And there were warning signs and people ignored them. And we also had warning signs and we ignored them. And not only have many of the things that we're experiencing today happened before and can give us an insight into good and not so good ways to handle it, but also, the foundations of interactions between ethnic groups, countries, political factions, it just goes back a very, very long way. And I know that's sort of like a very abstract way to look at it, but that's history, right? It's not one single thing. It's how all these things interact over time. And the more you learn about it, the more, and it's nuanced. And that's the other thing, which isn't to say that I think that when people say that something is complicated, it feels very dismissive. Everything's complicated and there is nuance and it's worth understanding, but that doesn't mean don't engage with it. It means, yes, it is complicated. Take the time to learn more about it and in good faith and talk to people and read because it is more complicated and there is more to understand there. And understanding that helps us hopefully today and in the future.
Yeah. So let's talk about murder mysteries. In 1930, Agatha Christie said, I'm going to quote, "The story as I see it should be first of all an account of human beings, their actions and reactions. The mystery, the problem to be solved, comes second." End of quote. However, there is a concern in murder mysteries and whodunit stories that the more you delve into a character and study them, the more confused and distanced the audience becomes from the actual plot and puzzle. Having written a masterpiece of a murder mystery with Pentiment, is it at all a concern of yours how much we study the characters? How do you strike this balance of keeping the puzzle rules simple without taking detours that could even potentially lead to a very emotional drama?
I think, I actually used a lot of things that I perceive as sort of Agatha Christie characteristics in the setup of Pentiment.
Yeah.
But the difference between Pentiment and an Agatha Christie story is that at the end of almost all Agatha Christie stories, there is one or more murderers definitively. And, the process, one of the things that I think is the same between Pentiment and, Death on the Nile or any of these is the setup is you sort of meet the person who's going to get killed and you encounter a number of characters that clearly have some problem with that character, but it's not clear what, and superficial things about them. And then the character dies. And then the detective goes, oh, okay, I'm going to start to dig into all these signs that I saw before and try to get to the truth. And at the end of a good Agatha Christie story, Poirot typically arrives at the truth and it's definitive. With Pentiment, I wanted to make it so that you do that process and there's no logic puzzles. Like one of the things we did in our prototype is we had alibis. And what we found is that wasn't interesting for our purposes because it just excludes people. Like when someone has an alibi, that means you don't pay attention to them anymore, really, unless the alibi itself is in question. But it was a lot of time spent finding out where people were and confirming or denying that they were there. And you didn't really get to know much about their character. You were just learning logistics, which isn't really the point. So we just got rid of it. And so we're like, we're never going to talk about alibi. Like it never comes up, which I noticed nobody actually comment, or very few people comment on it because they're engrossed by the characters themselves and their motives. And what I wanted to do is make it so that you never had enough time to really get to know everybody and that you had a feeling of unease. Excuse me. So when you are required to name someone, you're like, you might feel good about it, but very often people regret their choices right away. But you don't know for sure. And you do have some understanding of the people. But it's very unclear. And I felt like getting to know the people and their motives was actually the heart of what we wanted to do. We wanted to have the player understand all these characters did have motives, and some of them have, you know, things, aspects of their personality that will make you more or less likely to believe that they did it, or they had circumstances that make you more or less sympathetic toward them. But to sort of say to them, implicitly, you're not going to get a clear answer. Like, you're going to have to just make a choice as best as you can. And your criteria for that are your own. Like, no one else can decide that for you. So, in a lot of cases, people pick the person that they just don't like.
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, I don't know. And they'll say like, well, I don't want, for example, like, well, if Lucky did it, I don't want him to die for it, but I hate Ference. Whether or not they think that Ference did it, or, so, and it depends. Some people will say, Attilia, the widow, they're like, I'm not saying she's not justified, but she's very old. She seems like ready to die. Maybe she should just go. And that's what I like about that, is that it puts the responsibility on the player and it makes them examine their own motives for doing what they're doing. Some people do that very deeply, and other people kind of like, I hate that guy, he's going down. But that's kind of the point of it.
Yeah. And what makes Pentiment unique compared to other media dealing with same genre is the interactivity and length. It's these factors that make it stand out, and it's a fantastic combination of observing the protagonist through a long period of their life and also accompanying them as if we are them. Maybe a simple lie we tell as their character can change the course of their life, and that's where Pentiment becomes more than just a story you read in a book or watched in a movie. Many times I found myself thinking about my decisions before sleep or during my day about Pentiment, like what I could have done differently. And I think that brings us to a very interesting topic, which is choices in an interactive story. And I was talking to Helen Himper, the writer of Disco Elysium, a game similar to Pentiment in some aspects. She says something very interesting about trying to hide the choices and options you have in the game. And that's very interesting because most games nowadays just give you options to choose from, like, do you want to do this mission stealthily or loudly? Which is poorly executed, by the way, when at the beginning of a mission, a character usually says something like, hey, let's be smart and do it quietly. Like someone giving you 2 glasses of water to choose from, and they're shaking one and holding it up and say, hey, let's be smart about it. But choice is yours. Anyway, Pentiment is a rare case. I was just following along, just like in a real life where we often make decisions and later realize we had the other options as well. I was just following the natural flow based on my decisions, and the game wasn't constantly bombarding with me with 2 or 3 choices to pick from. Long story short, how do you design and approach player freedom and decision making in an RPG and a narrative game where it all feels natural?
It's more difficult than it looks, I guess. It has to do with kind of, you need kind of a high frequency, not an overwhelming, but a high frequency of reactivity. I actually took inspiration from Disco Elysium for their sort of micro adjustments to their conversation checks. Like the way that you interact with a character will have a subtle or a strong effect on how they interact with you in the future, mechanically. And very early on, we tried to set the expectation with something that's low stakes. For example, Martin, the boy who is the town thief, basically. You have these interactions with him where he's pretty sensitive and he's pretty vocal, but it's not forecast ahead of time that when you pick an option, he's going to react to it. But every time he does, we say this will be remembered. And because it's also accompanied by him being pretty vocal about usually disliking you or thinking you're cool, then that culminates in trying to get him to give you a friendly greeting on the second day when he's running through the meadow. and you see like, oh crap, like that actually had an impact on how that worked out. So it was a way of saying, hey, every time you see in dialogue something that says this will be remembered, either the character you're talking to or another character is paying attention to that, and that will be weighed in the calculation of a check later on. And maybe that'll come up soon. Maybe it'll come up literally at the end of the game. But it lets you know that the seemingly minor choices can be consequential, not world shattering, but they can be consequential. And in that way, we just try to let the player make decisions as they would, with the understanding sometimes you're going to pick something and people will care more about it than you might expect. And that keeps them, I think, more engaged because they're not just picking stuff. They're like, okay, let me read this. Let me actually pay attention to it. If you say something about how women don't have it that hard in, the 16th century, then Illuminata is probably not going to, take you very seriously about that. So there's that. And then there's also, again, then there's the payoff. So you have these micro adjustments, and then you have the checks, and then you also have to have the short, mid, and long-term reactivity. So for example, someone like Ursula, who, you first encounter when she's about 2 years old. She's the first in real world character that you encounter who's poking you in the foot with a stick. But you see her then as a 9-year-old, and then you see her as a young woman, and she has her own family. And the way that you interact with her is echoed across the acts, and it can result in different actual endings in the mural. There's one mural ending that you can only get through Ursula in a very specific way. It can also result in Ursula having a really bad ending. And it's based off of kind of minor interactions over the course of the game. So you have to see those payoffs, right away, and then in the midterm, and then at the end, for the player to really feel satisfied by them. But I do think that there's a delicate balance between, they can't be so constant that the player is like endlessly scrutinizing every dialogue choice. You want them to kind of just be in the moment. You shouldn't we actually talked about forecasting. Hey, there's going to be a reaction here. And everyone was like, no, that makes me freak out. Like, if I see that, then I'm going to freak out. And then also, for example, we have a rolling save, and there's no randomness. So there's no way to reload. Like, so if you fail a check, you're like, well, that's how it goes. Like, yeah. I wasn't able to convince Werner to tell me, what he knew about the murder in Act 2. Well, yeah, I guess so. We explained, we said, you did this, you did this, you did this. And you're like, okay.
Yeah.
And you just keep going. So it's a delicate balancing act. And there were cases where players felt more aggravated than satisfied, but it's all a learning experience for us as well. Hopefully in the future we can refine this and keep making it better.
Yeah. And it's very satisfying and rewarding because, we are playing an interactive game, and I'm making choices. And usually in games that I had a conversation with a pretty well known, I'm not gonna name him or her, narrative director, says usually on big games we just sell the illusion of choice. I was like, oh, that's dark, but like, I'm making decisions, and the game is and I'm supposedly thinking that, oh yeah, maybe I'm changing something here, but at the end, like, there are 2 or 3 endings happen, which are not very satisfying. But in Pentiment, like, it even changes the way someone talking to me, and I was like, man, I wanted to be friendly with this guy. Now I messed up. It was I know I messed up, and now he's mad at me. That's bad, but that's life, and that's actually, I enjoyed a lot that sometimes the game made me feel shitty. Like, oh man, I shouldn't have said that. But move on. I'm gonna be a better person next time. And the start of
it's gonna be okay.
Yeah.
The game is still okay.
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing too. Is because a lot of people, especially when they start playing Pentiment, I've heard a lot of people say that they stress out a lot. Because they're like, I keep failing checks, like I keep screwing up, and like I can't convince this guy, or like this person got mad at me or whatever. But then as time goes on, they're like, oh, like Andreas is kind of a fuck up, or like
Yeah.
Andreas is not a detective. Like he's not actually equipped to do this, but he's doing his best. And it's kind of the story is kind of about Andreas not succeeding at a lot of things. Like he succeeds in some ways and he fails in other ways. And that is also just life.
Exactly.
And, you know, for the player, it's like, relax, you know, failure and accepting failure is part of life. So the story goes on. You didn't wreck anything. You know, the story is fine. Just keep going with it and it'll be okay.
And it's such a great idea and a great way of looking at it, that the protagonist that we are influencing a lot in the story is as incomplete as I might be in a murder mystery. I mean,
Yeah.
we start Pentiment like, oh, you guys are screwed. I'm going to find out who did this. And literally you go further. Oh, it's real life. I don't know. And Andreas is just like that. So there's this, like, I know, dude. I know how is it going on with you. I know. So it's a very, very, very unique feeling that you don't often see in games. Okay, let's talk about your favorites. So what are some of your favorite movies you would recommend? I'm following you on Twitter and I see always you're trying to update yourself with classic, with new ones. But what are some of your favorites?
Geez, I mean, within the last few years, I mean, I finally saw In the Mood for Love, which
Wow, yeah.
I can't believe I didn't watch, but it was I just thought it was an incredibly moving film. And it's a very emotional film, and there's very little dialogue. It's so much about actual mood, and just the sort of interactions between these two people. And it's just very intense and just very powerful film. Trying to think of anything else. Well, I saw First Reformed, which I know came out. Actually, it was 2017.
Yeah,
And
Paul Schrader, right?
Yeah, Paul Schrader, and I really like you know, religion as a subject in film, and that was another one where I was kind of like, I don't know why I didn't watch it, but that was another one where, and I saw a lot of people had really negative reactions to it, but I thought it was, again, very powerful, and I thought it was really plainly stated in the film. You know, very early on when Ethan Hawke's character is talking to I wouldn't necessarily say he's an eco-terrorist, but the sort of like guy who is really in despair about the state of the world and global warming and climate change and everything. And he says, you know, like life is basically faith and despair together. Like you're never going to escape despair, but faith is what buoys you in it. And, you know, it has such powerful imagery too, like, again, that I feel like is just really well done. Like, so he, you know, the Reverend has a drinking problem throughout the whole film. And later you find out he has medical issues as well. And they're like, you know, you should take care of yourself. And so there's that scene where he pours I think it's Irish whiskey into the glass, and then he pours Pepto-Bismol in it. Which is ridiculous, but to me that is faith and despair,
yeah.
Right? It's the despair of alcohol and the faith, like I can still get better.
Yeah,
I can still take care of myself. And I don't know. I thought it was an incredible movie. And then I'm trying to think if there's anything else recently that I was really just super stoked about. Yeah, I do find in a lot of cases, and part of it is you know, and obviously, you know, Scorsese has said this a lot. You know, the sort of mid-budget film is kind of, there's not a lot of them these days. So, you know, I watch a lot of older films because they're kind of more, they're less blockbustery, and they're kind of more just about more human interactions. You know, they're not necessarily indie scale, but they feel like, you know, mid-sized films, which we used to have a lot more of. And so, you know, going back, and some of them are not good. You know, some of them I see and I'll just watch on a whim. You know, I watched The Hunting Party, which was in 1971. It was Gene Hackman, Oliver Reed, and Candice Bergen. What a cast. And it was in the same year that Oliver Reed did The Devils, fantastic movie. Same year that Gene Hackman did French Connection, incredible movie. This movie was awful. Like, it was really bad. And I'm like, well, you know, you can't win them all. You know, like, even if you have a good cast. And you know, I don't go out of my way to watch movies I know are bad. But, you know, it does make me think. And I go like, why is this so bad? Like, what is not working about it?
Yeah.
And then, yes, I'm not making films, but storytelling is really at the heart, and creating experiences and sympathies and excitement and anticipation of what's going to happen with characters. That's a big part of what I do. And so I'm not trying to be a filmmaker. I'm not trying to recreate the medium of film within games, but the storytelling fundamentals I feel like are if not exactly the same, they're very similar. So yeah, lot to learn from a lot of people.
Yeah. I 2 days ago I watched this Japanese movie, Monster. Have you watched it?
No, but I've heard a lot of my friends have said that it's very good, but I heard it's also upsetting. Is it?
No, actually, no.
Okay.
I thought the same, but this movie won the best screenplay at Cannes, and it's the best screenplay of the year, in my opinion. And I strongly recommend it for you.
I'll check it out.
Yeah,
I'll try to check it out as soon as I can.
Yeah. So, what are some of your favorite games?
You know, recently I got really into, again, I'm like so behind the times. I finally got around to playing Metal Gear Solid 5, although it's a long game, so I'm not super far into it. But you know, I feel like Kojima's storytelling is one of those things where you either like or don't like, and or you sort of like tolerate. And I like the quirkiness of it. Again, he's like maybe the biggest film buff of all high profile game directors. And you can really see that come across in his games, and the way he tells stories and his emphasis on cinematic stuff. But the thing is, MGS5, the core gameplay loop is really strong. Like it's, I think the controls are kind of overloaded, which is a pet peeve of mine, but there's so much you can do. The open world is very cool to explore. You have tons of flexibility in how you approach the things. Things like the sandstorms are really cool. The buddy system is awesome. It's a really surprisingly tight game. Like I from playing previous, you know, Metal Gear Solid games, I wouldn't have expected that. And it's really cool. I'm kind of stopped at a point where I got super stressed out. So I need to like wait and go back into it. I'm looking forward to Dragon's Dogma 2. I only played a little bit of the first game. And I kind of kicked myself because I've heard that it really picks up, and people have told me such great stories about Dragon's Dogma. Dragon's Dogma 2 looks like really exciting for the future. Also, Pacific Drive, I'm very stoked to play. My friend Paul Dean wrote on that, so I'm very happy for him and very excited for that game. And then last year, my biggest game last year was Phantom Liberty. I mean, I will say I'm friends with more than a few devs at CDPR, but when the game originally launched, when 2077 launched, I was like, man, I can see what you're trying to do here, but there are some real problems. And you know, it's not like I was the only person saying that. And but I was like, man, like there's really cool storytelling here. You know, the way they do first person conversations is crazy. Like if you've ever heard like a technical breakdown of how they do it, it's the resources required are nuts. And then they have their 1.5 patch, their 1.6 patch, and then their 2.0 patch and Phantom Liberty. And man, like almost every issue that I had with the core gameplay completely fixed. I was super and like it was, I'd said a bunch of stuff like, you know, if I were in charge, I'd change this way. And I'm not saying that they listened to me, but that's most of what I said is what they did. So I was like, all right. And then Phantom Liberty's story, I just thought was, you know, they told an espionage story, but it felt modern. It didn't feel like mired down in kind of spy genre trappings. Like it felt like, you know, it used the best parts of them without feeling like, yeah, we're doing a James Bond thing. It never felt like that. But you'd have like, you know, we sneak into a high society party. Hey, that's cool. You know, that's a cool feeling of it. Or like guiding, why can't I remember Idris Elba's character, but like guiding him along the stealth path. Those are like really cool gameplay moments, tons of cool custom content, good choice and consequence. A lot of the side quests also in Phantom Liberty, like all the stuff you do for Mr. Hands has like really great. And usually it's very simple. It's a bifurcating choice. You know, you get a quest, you get 90% of the way through it. And then they're like, oh, there's a complication. You want to do this or you want to do this? And then you make it. And then there's a payoff like a few days later or something. And even though it feels kind of formulaic, I don't care. It's well done. Like, it made me think, it made me make choices, and then I lived with it and it felt good. So yeah, I was just, and then the polish was really high. So I was really happy for the team and the game. I think they should be really proud of it.
Yeah, me too. I finished that game twice after
Nice.
the new one. Yeah. You mentioned spy games. Now I have to mention this. I wasn't thinking about it at all, but one of the most underrated stealth spy games is Alpha Protocol from Obsidian, and I loved that game so much when it came out. And when I was playing that game, it was, I don't know, 2009. I don't remember exactly. 11.
Yeah,
maybe?
I think it was 10. It was the same. I think it came out the same year that we released New Vegas.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was playing that. I was like, I can't believe no other people thought about a spy game like this. But I'm very curious to see more like that in the future from Obsidian. And yeah, I love that game. Yeah. So
thank you. Oh, sorry.
No, go on ahead. You were also working on that game, right?
What's that?
You also worked on that game.
A little. I worked on I took over the close quarters combat system. So yeah, we had a close quarters combat system hand to hand that was kind of in rough shape, I think. And we just needed something that was practical and worked. And I think it did the job. I think it could have been better, but it did the job. But I can't take credit for any of the cool story or dialogue stuff. But I will say that I thought the premise was super cool. I thought the story structure was awesome. And I'd love to do something like that in the future, or see the company do something like that in the future. And one thing that I do think of, and this is something I answered in a Q&A on my YouTube channel, was, I do wonder if the spy genre itself is not as appealing to people, let's say, more than one generation removed from mine, because I grew up during the Cold War, like it was still going on. It ended. It ended practically when I was 15 years old. But, for the first 15 years of my life, the idea of the Iron Curtain and this intractable conflict and the spy stories that came out of that, they carried into my adulthood. Like, oh yeah, I remember the Cold War. That was so crazy. Like, remember when you, like, going into anywhere, east of the Iron Curtain seemed like not possible. And so, like, when I went to Moscow in 2005, I was like, this is so crazy. Like, it's not crazy. Like, the Cold War is over. But I wonder if those stories are as compelling to younger people who did not grow up with them. And then there's also obviously some of the staples of the genre, like James Bond, have a tradition that in itself has lots of prejudices that are sort of built in, that, over, like the last bulk, sort of segment of the franchise, they've kind of somewhat moved out of, but not entirely. So I think that genre is still very interesting to me. I don't know if it's super interesting to people much younger than me. So I think it would be cool. But, this is one of those things, like I said at the beginning, where I feel like it's probably going to have to kick around in my head for a while, and I'll look for an opportunity, and, we'll see where it goes. But I think it would be really cool to do another game like that.
Yeah. I was born the day Cold War was done, so
wow!
I'm very much into the genre, and I think by the look at the numbers on the new James Bond movies, people are excited about it, and it's funny that IO is working on a James Bond game, and I remember when it was announced, people are on Twitter were like, "Oh, look at Alpha Protocol!" Yeah, I was like, yeah.
I love the Hitman games.
Oh yeah. They're fantastic, and they're kind of selling the same premise that James Bond did. So yeah,
yep.
This is it, Mr. Sawyer. Since I was a teenager, I've been enjoying your fantastic games. They respect players as individuals seeking adventures and good stories, and your art and hard work have given us nothing but masterpieces, one after another. And after many years of wanting to talk to, I can say it was worth every second of it. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.